In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O heavenly King, Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of good gifts and giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us of all impurity, and save our souls, O good one. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. Today's the day I make the YouTube algorithm happy with our YouTube channel again by going back to regular posts. I don't know if live streams count, but this is now another weekly video on our YouTube channel. So, mazel tov. And welcome to year 2 of the Catechesis program, the new and improved year 2 of the Catechesis program. Where we're going to get out of the Old Covenant and into the New Covenant. So like I was telling a couple people before we started, the structure of this year is that we're going to go into the Beatitudes for a few weeks, and we're going to kind of deep dive into those. Then we're going to do the Gospels in some incredible detail on the Gospel. And then we'll end with the Holy Mysteries. And when we get into the Holy Mysteries, I'll get into all kinds of things about, because we'll be talking about a lot of things that possibly people don't typically consider to be one of the Holy Mysteries, but we will. We'll talk about all kinds of different things because of it's kind of the history of how we understand the Holy Mysteries to be. But that's a while from now. So tonight, the big thing is to give us the transition. So we were in Old Covenant land all of this last year, and now we're going to transition into the New Covenant. And so the question comes, what is the difference between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant? And what I think is probably going to happen is I'm going to try and chart the Orthodox understanding of it, which falls kind of in the middle of two extremes, which would make Aristotle very happy with me. And so I have at least that going for me. There's two extreme, I think there's there's more, there's lots of extreme things you can think, but there's two main extremes you can go with Old Covenant, New Covenant. You can either understand them to be so fundamentally different from each other that you reject one of them as being not good. And so either you're a Marcionite, and so you're like New Covenant only, throw out the Old Testament, all of that's bad. You go full Marcionite or full Gnostic. Or you go full like Jesus is bad, full New Covenant is all bad, and you go full like Reformed or Orthodox Judaism. That's one extreme area. On the other side, you can identify the Old Covenant and the New Covenant so closely that you basically don't think that there's a big difference, that Jesus showed up and didn't actually change anything. He just explained the Old Covenant or something, some version of that where there is no real difference between the two of them. Or you can think of like they're both covenants. They're not old and new. They're just like, this is how Jews get saved and this is how everyone else gets saved. But they're like they're like parallel in some way, but there's not like a transition or anything like that. Those are kind of the two extremes that I'm going to try and avoid and say that between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, there are significant continuities and significant discontinuities insofar as one is the Old Covenant and one is the New Covenant, and yet they are both covenants with the same persons. They're both covenants with God. So, what is a covenant? Becomes a really good question. What I'm going to start with is what is a covenant, and I'm going to try and frame it in the way the Old Covenant and Old Testament scriptures frame their covenant with God. So, when we think of a covenant, we tend to think of maybe a treaty or an agreement or a contract or these sorts of things. And that's not entirely out of the question. Sometimes you hear people say something like, well, covenant's not a contract. It's a relationship. A contract is a relationship. It's just not one you typically have a lot of positive emotions about, but it is a relationship. And so that's not a good way to get into it. And we typically don't want to define things as not other things. We want to say like what they really are. Here's how the Old Testament scriptures frame a covenant based on how they write down the scriptures. So like the genre, in a sense. I'm going to start with the book of Deuteronomy because it's more obvious there and then get into more stuff. Deuteronomy has a structure. That structure basically boils down to, in the first part, this is who God is and what God has done for the people of Israel. Then you get into the middle, where there's a whole bunch of rules and expectations. And then at the end, it's basically like, this is what will happen if you follow the rules and expectations. This is what will happen if you don't follow the rules and expectations. And then at the very end, you get an exhortation that's like Moses saying, please, oh, please, whatever you do, please do this covenant. It'll be very good for you if you do. It'll be very bad if you don't. Please take this seriously. And as we know from Israelite history, they did not take it very seriously. But that structure is not unique to Deuteronomy. It didn't start with Deuteronomy. It's not something the Old Testament writers did on their own. What they're doing is writing down their covenant with God in a known genre of the time. And it has a very pretentious title. It is a suzerain vassal treaty of the Akkadian type. So what does that mean? Acadia is part of Babylon. So there's all that baggage. But what it is when a king, when a ruler went somewhere and took over a new place, they would write a treaty with the people. And they would be a suzerain and they would be vassals. And the suzerain would be in charge of things and the vassals would not be in charge of things. And they had a treaty that defined that relationship. And basically those treaties would basically be something like, I, king of whatever cool place that conquers people, I came in and I established laws and I drove out the barbarians and I made a big dam that brought you irrigation canals. I did all these things for you. Then it'd be a list of, here's what you have to do to keep me satisfied. You have to pay this many taxes and you're not allowed to burn poison ivy branches or something. The rules, whatever rules the king feels like putting together. Typically, they're not insane rules, but I don't know. It's kind of at the whim of the king. He just kind of does what he wants. And then at the end, it basically says, and if you follow all of these rules, I will provide you military support so that you don't get conquered by someone else. I would hate that. And I will provide you with food if there's a famine. And I will provide you with blah, 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 etc. But if you don't follow these rules, I will come in and I will reconquer you and I will make worse rules. Mark my word. Or I will wipe you from the face of the earth and I'll just put my people here or something. And so, when God is revealing himself to Moses and to the other Israelites, and Moses is recording their relationship, what we see is that the way it's framed in Deuteronomy, and I'll get the rest of the Torah, but we'll get there in a second. The way it's framed in Deuteronomy is as one of these suzerain vassal treaties. Deuteronomy starts with, I, God, came in and did all these things for you. And it's basically chapters 1 through 4 is rehash from Moses gets born to they're about to walk in the Holy Land. It recounts the whole Exodus, all the wanderings in the field, the Amalekites, all that fun stuff. Then it's a list of things you need to do to be in this good relationship with me. And then at the end, it's the famous blessings and curses, which is basically if you follow all these rules, these things will happen. If you don't follow these rules, these things will happen. It's a suzerain vassal treaty with God as suzerain and Israel as vassal. What's some interesting points about this? One, The suzerain did not directly run vassal states. Vassal states ran themselves within the reign of the suzerain. So the suzerain had rules, but they didn't typically take over the government of the vassal state in like its details. The vassal state still ran itself. It was, in some sense, a co-run thing, or like sort of sub-reigning, or ministering, that kind of a thing. This mirrors in the way that we see God working with all of creation regularly. God very rarely micromanages the universe. He's got like the angels, and the angels take care of lots of different things. And he's got humans, and humans take care of lots of different things. And this is, as we get into the Gospels, this is how salvation is framed by the New Testament authors, is as us joining the kingdom, us joining the reign of Christ, not just as subjects at the bottom rung of the ladder, but as ministers, as also taking care of things. That's what a patron saint is. When we think of patron saints, that's just humans that have become ministers in the kingdom. So that's a point to make, to think about when we think of a covenant, especially covenant, the Old and the New Covenant. The framework of how they're understood from the very beginning when they're being written down is that Israel is not just slave of God. Israel is vassal. God is in charge, and within the framework that God has set up all of creation, Israel runs itself. Israel governs and ministers and takes care of certain things and has real authority because God has given real authority. God is not micromanaging. He just has like a framework of this is what it should look like. Another thing that's important about these is you would always have two copies. You would make one copy and it would go to like the temple, and it would be made, and it would go in front of the feet of God, whatever God you're doing this in front of as a divine witness. Basically saying if someone breaks this treaty, the God will get involved, and nobody wants the God to get involved. And then the other copy would go with the king, the suzerain. So that he has like a list of like, these are the things that I expect out of blah, blah, blah country. And they'll do the things. And the other one's in the temple of the God at blah, blah, blah country so that they have the things. What we see in the Old Covenant with Israel is that they also make two copies of the suzerain vassal treaty, and both of them go in the Ark of the Covenant. Because the Ark of the Covenant is at the footstool of God and the footstool of the king, who happens to also be God. And so they're understanding their relationship with God as not only is he the suzerain, he's also the vassal king in some way, because it's with him in both places. And this is why, early Israel, there is no king. That ends up being a problem. But it's also not entirely true to say that there is no king. There is a king. God is king. It's just that no one cares, and that goes poorly for them. And so he ends up setting up later a human king in his image, but he's supposed to be king. That's why he tells Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me as king. That's how he set this up. So, all that being said, as we talked about with the 10 Commandments, what has God done? I think that's probably not something I need to get really into what has God done for the Israelites, because we know a lot of things about that. What are these 10 commandments and then these 613 commandments? What are they getting at? And we talked about that. They're called the Decalogue in Greek. They're called the 10 logi, the 10 words. And they're probably best understood because the king that's giving these rules is not a human king and isn't a demon and isn't a creature. It's not rules on the whim of the king. It's rules in the will of God, and the will of God is what creates the fabric of reality. And so when we look at these rules, there's a reason why, like if you break Hammurabi's code or something, like one of these other like treaty things, like you're not necessarily you're not necessarily doing a like actually cosmically bad thing if you break Hammurabi's code, because Hammurabi's code is a list of a bunch of rules made up by like some guy and apparently his demon friend that he introduces at the beginning. And they're kind of like, they're both creatures. Even the demon, who's really smart, but he's like still a creature. It's still kind of like just like what they want. Whereas with this, if you break one of these rules, what you're doing is you're going against the will of God, which means you're going against the fabric of reality. And so in a deeper sense, this covenant isn't just a list of rules. Despite being a list of rules, it's not just a list of rules. It's more than that. It's a list of rules that actually really teach about you, the person who's supposed to follow them, and the rest of creation and God. For my again, plug of the whole structure of this course from Evagrius Ponticus, knowledge of the self, knowledge of the rest of creation, knowledge of God, and moving in that direction. That's what the old covenant is supposed to do. It's what the new covenant is supposed to do. And it's because of who the king is that's giving this covenant. So, questions up to that point of what is a covenant? Before we run into specific old, specific new. Okay. What is the goal of the old covenant? And what is the goal of the new covenant? That's how we're going to distinguish them and show that they go together. The scriptures begin with the Torah for a reason, and the Torah begins with Genesis for a reason, and Genesis begins with a description of creation for a reason. To grossly oversimplify the two accounts of creation at the beginning of Genesis, one of them shows God creating order in the world, setting up order in the world, filling that order with life, and then creating humans to minister that, all framed within a liturgical processional liturgy in a temple, and framed around the fact that mankind is made in the image of God. That's Genesis 1. Genesis 2 builds off of that, and a lot of what we see in Genesis 2 is Adam doing all the things God just did. So there's this funky thing that happens when you read Genesis, and you get done with chapter 1, and then you start chapter 2, and then there's the seventh day. And it's like in the start of chapter 2. And like, why did we pick there? Why not just move the chapter break 4 verses later? Who knows? But something that allows me to then segue into by using that example is that chapter 2 really describes the seventh day. And it's important for us to know. Days 1, 2, 3, God separates things. Light from dark, water from water, land from water. He creates distinctions. He gives form. He gives order to a chaotic mess. Days 4, 5, 6, he fills those things with life. Day 4, sun, moon, stars in the light and dark. You have day 5 is birds and fish in the waters above and waters below. Day 6, you have the animals on the land, and then humankind comes in. Day 7, God rests. That's what we're told. It's important for us to know that this word for resting is not like relaxing. It's not like God worked so hard for 6 days. He just needs like a day off. That's not what it means. It's rest like when you roll a stone down a hill and it comes to rest. It like gets where it's supposed to go and then it stops moving because it has reached its goal. So God resting on the seventh day is not God like laying down. It's God sitting on his throne, king of this ordered creation that is being ministered by the angels and by mankind. And so that's what day 7 is supposed to be. So what do we see happen on day 7? Well, we zoom in on Adam. What does Adam do? He does the God things. He names the animal. God brings him all the animals, and he names the animals. He puts order into this creation, just like God did on days 1, 2, 3. What else happens to Adam? He is put into sleep and he is pulled apart. And now Adam embodies order as distinction between parts that complement each other. Because now he's Adam and Eve. Or at this point, really, it's Adam and Isha. I guess Ish and Isha. It's weird. Different people getting names at different times in the scriptures. It's hard to keep track of sometimes. But now, not only has he done ordering by separating animals, he also embodies that order, because order is embodied by distinguishing between things that then have a relationship with each other. So the light and darkness, they're distinct, but they have a relationship with each other. They cycle. Waters above and waters below have a relationship with each other. It's in 4 chapters, it's about to get very close, but it really is supposed to stay a little bit separate. But they have a relationship, and one of the embodiments of this relationship is what we call the water cycle. Land and sea have a relationship, and these sorts of things. So Adam and Eve have a relationship, despite being distinct. They're also in relationship, and Adam and Eve have this goal, this charge to fill the world. To go forth and multiply and fill the world. What we see humans doing on this 7th day is, or at least how is Moses framing our understanding of God's rest in the 7th day? And what's supposed to happen is that humans start doing the works of God. They start acting like God because they are his image. So, the goal being then eventually that Adam and Eve are throned. That they would one day rest with God. They would one day sit in divine council. I'm going to posit that a good way to understand the Old Covenant and the New Covenant is along these same frameworks. Because I think it's fairly safe to frame anything by Genesis 1 and 2. If you're talking scripturally. Genesis 1 and 2 is at the start for a reason. How do we see God now working in the Old Covenant? Well, after the dispersal of the nations, and all the nations fall and are no longer worshiping God, Abraham is called out of Ur. He is separated. But he's separated in order to distinguish him, but also to set up a relationship. Abraham is told that he will have descendants in this specific plot of land, and that all of the nations will bless themselves in his seed. And so he's brought out of the nations, kind of the way light is brought out of darkness in day 1. It's in order to set up light and give darkness the relationship with light. That one day, there will be a day that has no night. There will be a time when night has a certain relationship with day, which is that the night has become like the day. And so Abraham has been pulled out of the nations to make another nation so that all the nations will one day be like that nation. How do we see this go? Poorly for a little bit. And then Moses, I'm going to jump away forward. Moses gets brought out of Egypt. Why? He gets brought out of Egypt as the human head of this nation, a nation no longer constituted basically genetically. It is not even maybe mostly direct descendants of Abraham that are in the Israelites that leave Egypt. It's a lot of Egyptians as well. And they're being brought out and they're being constituted as a nation. And the way you know something is a nation or something is a people in the ancient world is they have the same land, the same king, and the same religion. Basically. And so what do we see with Abraham? We're getting pulled out. We're getting this kind of Adam-Eve framework of it's like people descended from Abraham. It's really his blood relatives. In the Exodus, we see the other framework of understanding Israel is that it's and this idea of what an ancient people is. Same land, same king, same religion. It just happens that their king and their religion are the same thing, and that's tied up with the land. So they get pulled out. Why? In order to be a nation that all the other nations will become like. God specifically says, I'm pulling you out so that Pharaoh will know that I am Yahweh. And Yahweh here really means something like I am the one who makes things be. And so he's trying to show, he's doing stuff with them, but he's also doing this for Egypt. He's not just doing it for Israel and like, forget Egypt. He's doing it for Israel. He's doing it for Egypt. And because he wants Egypt to know that he is the Lord, not Pharaoh, not Isis, not Osiris, not Seth, not any of those other Egyptian gods. And so we see constituted this nation that all the nations are supposed to be like. And even within that nation, because they can't handle it, you start to get these, what I'm going to describe as concentric circles or hierarchies or levels or different things like that. You have Moses. Moses talks to God face to face. That's how we all will one day see God, for better or for worse. But Moses experiences that. And then Aaron and Miriam are like Moses, but not quite as intimate with God. And the 70 elders are like that, but not quite as intimate. And the priesthood is like that, but not quite as intimate. And the Levites are like that, but not quite as intimate. And so you have these layers of closeness to the reality that is the end goal. The end goal is that God and man are like this. And that's embodied in Jesus, and we'll get to him in a second. But Moses is the person that Israel looks to right now to see what that's like. And you have these concentric circles. And it's these concentric circles of closeness to God, and it's these concentric circles of, Paul puts it really well. He says, imitate me like I imitate Christ. It's that idea, is that Aaron and Miriam should be like Moses, and the elders should be like them, and the priests should be like Aaron, and the Levites should be like the priests, and the people should be like that's what it's supposed to be. And if they all do that, then everyone is getting more and more like Moses, and Moses is getting more and more like Jesus. That's the idea. And then, what do all of Israel's neighbors do? The Moabites and the Edomites, these like Abrahamic peoples, well, they should be like Israel. And what should Assyria and Egypt, well, they should be like them as they get closer. That's the idea. It goes really poorly for a long time. And if you've ever read the Old Testament, you're aware that basically they never did any of this, how they were supposed to. But if we think of the Old Covenant in creation terms, what we're seeing enacted in the Old Covenant is really this days 1, 2, 3 thing, with a view to days 4, 5, 6. Separation. He is pulling Israel out of the nations, and he's constituting a separateness, a distinction, with a view to things becoming like it, to those things being filled with life. Questions on Old Covenant before I now jump into New Covenant? Okay, that being said then, the New Covenant is the next thing. It's going to be days 4, 5, 6 with a view towards day 7. And so the New Covenant is this filling, the nations becoming like Israel. It's when basically the borders between Israel and the other nations on this kind of like physical level break down. And the way it's framed in the New Testament often is the scattered tribes are brought back. And that's because by the time you get to the Second Temple period, you have like 1.5 tribes of Israel left. You have Judah, Benjamin, and then like the Levites, and that's it. The other 10, gonzo. There's really some really fascinating work on this that I'm not really privy to, but I'll tell it to you because I know 2 things about it. You can look for lists of names in these random nations that we know the other tribes went to, and you can look at lists of names to try to find out how long you have distinctly Hebrew names. And that's about how long you can tell that like the tribe of Asher is still like what's kind of constituted as Asher before it like goes into and like spreads. That's fascinating. I have nothing to do with that other than when the Gentiles are brought into the New Covenant, the way that's being understood, the way that they grapple with that and understand is, well, what are the Gentiles now? Well, they're not just the nations. They're the nations, but they've got 10 tribes of Israel mixed into them in some way. And so bringing the 10 lost tribes back into Israel is now the same thing as bringing the Gentiles in, because the Gentiles are now a little bit more like Israel because they've got Dan and Asher and Ephraim and stuff mixed into them. And so when we see Christ coming in the New Testament, when we see God coming down and saying, all right, step 2, it's not that the new covenant is a total wipe of the old covenant. It's the old covenant. The new covenant can't happen without the old covenant. You can't have days 4, 5, 6 of creation if you don't have days 1, 2, 3, because you can't fill stuff that doesn't exist. And so the old covenant makes the circumstances necessary for the salvation of the Gentiles, because the salvation of the Gentiles is being brought into the nation of Israel. You can't do that if there's not a nation of Israel to be brought into. So the old covenant is necessary levels of important, and not entirely gone, and we'll talk about that here in a second, but it's also not true that nothing has changed. We've moved on from day 3 now. We're at days 4, 5, 6, in a sense, and I'll talk about moving on here in a second. But we're at days where we're at bringing in stuff. We're at filling all of these distinctions, forming those right relationships, hopefully so that we all can become a little bit more like Moses, because he's a little bit more like Jesus. And becoming like Moses is the same thing as becoming like Jesus. And we have a fancy word for this, theosis or deification. I'm not going to go hard into that right now because I have a feeling you can either watch all of my other YouTube videos, and I'm sure I get into it more there, but like when we get into the holy mysteries, that's like the only thing I'm going to talk about. So we will get there, just not probably in this particular lesson, because I'm trying not to go late and into Vespers, which people who have been here before will know that that is a chronic problem of mine. We're being brought in. Israel can be thought of as kind of the priesthood of the world. The church is the priesthood of the world. The church is supposed to be that community that is there with God, present in our temples, that people can come be more like and join and become more like the holiest members of our church, who are becoming more like Christ, who is the express image of the Father. That's the idea of this. And so that's the new covenant. In a grand nutshell, that's the difference, is that we're on days 4, 5, 6, basically, the filling with life. Where in the old covenant, people weren't deified in the sense that they actually, like human nature we had not experienced God's having taken our nature and brought it up into heaven. We've experienced that now. We have a totally different world than they had before the incarnation. The demons are no longer in charge in any sense of the term. They're just here being terrible. But they're not in charge of anything anymore. God has gone into his kingdom. He has come into his kingdom in a new way and is running it through his ministers. And the language in the New Testament that points to this, I think, the best is when Paul starts calling everyone holy. And when you see in the Old Covenant, the holy ones or things like that, we're like talking about angels and stuff, typically. In the New Covenant, Paul's calling a whole bunch of humans the holy ones in such and such a place, and the holy ones in Corinth, stuff like that. And it's pointing to this reality that humans are now being brought up into this relationship. We have people like Enoch, we have people like Elijah, we have people like Moses, we have people like that in the Old Covenant who are like these kind of one-offs of being brought into the divine council and being able to reign with God in the meaningful. David, all the kings of Judah, they're like these one-offs. Joel tells us that one day I will pour out my spirit on all peoples. The idea is that God is bringing all of humanity into this now, with a view to day 7. And so day 7 then is that rest. It's that sitting on the throne. It's that co-reigning with Christ as the vassals of God the suzerain. And that's then what we call heaven. And so the new covenant, which is what we experience in our earthly sojourn, is with a view towards that. That's why we can talk about the point of Christianity is salvation. The point of the old covenant is Christianity. And the point of Christianity is heaven. is salvation, is reigning with Christ. Questions about any of that before I jump into the last thing, because I'm doing great on time. Okay. So what do I do with all this information? Why does any of this matter? Well, what is the pattern of creation? The pattern of creation is moving from chaos to order. That's what Genesis 1 is trying to show us. God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and there's water everywhere. And when you see water everywhere, that is your clue that the ancient person you're reading is trying to give you chaos. It's chaos. It's madness. It's all over the place. When you see hell described in the New Covenant, you see it described as a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. Gnashing of teeth is a symbol of madness. The symbol of there's like the severest form of inhumanity being embodied by this human. Hopefully, we're becoming the opposite of that and not becoming more like that. So, chaos is not good and order is good. And so, what we want to do with our lives is we want to take the little bit of creation that we now, as priest, prophet, king in this covenant, we're our little vassal, and we're a little vassal inside of our family, and the family is its own little vassal inside of the community, and the community and the parish is its own little vassal within the greater church. So like we have all these layers of ministering. You have the actual authority given by God to you to order your little chunk of whatever it is. And that's a physical space. It's the people that you meet. It's the projects you're involved in. It's yourself first. Paul talks about that. I was like, get this figured out. And then you can try figuring other people out. Jesus frankly says this. Remove the beam in your own eye before you take the splinter out of your neighbor's eye. You're in charge of that. It's like really yours to like be in charge of. And that's an up and a down. Because it's yours to be in charge of. Which means God isn't micromanaging it to the point that he won't let it fail. You can fail at this. It is possible. We call that hell. Hell is failing at ordering this. And then all the stuff that comes from that, the ordering around that. But you can also succeed at it. So the good part is you can succeed at it with the grace of God. It's not possible without God. That's why John can say things like all good comes from God, because there is no other orderer other than God. This covenant is, remember, the vassals don't run themselves independent of the suzerain. They run themselves within the reign, within the authority of the suzerain. And so if we want to order ourselves, what we need to do is do the things to ourselves that are in accord with what the suzerain who created us and the will that made us how we are. It's to do the things that are congruent with that. And what does that look like? Well, we can take something from the days of creation. Days 1, 2, 3 is separation. Days 4, 5, 6 is filling. And day 7 is rest. We need to be separate from the things that we need to be separate from. First, sin. We need to separate ourselves from sin by the grace of God. God is going to separate us from sin, but we work with him. We don't have this theology where God just zaps us and does things to us. And we don't have a theology where we have to just do everything. It is synergia. It is co-action with God. Our acts become divine acts because God acts in us. That's how we understand works. That's how we understand the faith works whole thing that I'm sure we'll get into at some point. You are not saved by faith and not by works, and you're not saved by works and not by faith. Your works and your faith are the same thing. What you do is the embodiment of your faith, all by the grace of God. And so we need to separate ourselves from sin. We need to separate ourselves from things that lead us to sin that aren't sin in and of themselves. Like, if you're an alcoholic, not only should you not drink alcohol, you probably shouldn't go to bars and order water. That's just like not good for you and obvious when you're not the person in the situation. And that's the hard part. What we shouldn't separate ourselves from is the community, the church, those sorts of things. God doesn't save us as individuals in this kind of really individualistic American way. He saves the church, his body, and all the members thereof. We should be separating ourselves from sin. We should also be acting as the community where other people can be here and also not sin. We should not be putting other people in a situation where they're going to sin. We should be doing everything we can to encourage virtue, to support virtue, to make virtue possible. And that's kind of this day 4, 5, 6 stuff. We should be filling this distinction. We should be filling this separation with life. So that things that are distinct, things that have been distinguished, can become more like this. Because there's no point in us distinguishing the church from other things if the church is going to suck like everything else. That doesn't do anything. You just have 2 bad things now. We need to separate the church and make that meaningful. The church needs to be filled with virtue, filled with life, filled with grace, filled with the love of God and neighbor. We talk about this in the New Covenant regularly of like, your life should look different from your average pagan's life or your average secular person's life. Not because the being different is the goal. It's just that like the average pagan life and the average secular life is just like really destructive for you. And so if your life doesn't look very different from it, then you're getting destroyed. And God doesn't want you to get destroyed. And I really hope you don't want you to get destroyed. And so the point of the church is that we stop living in destructive ways. We start following the covenant. We start following what is given to us as a list of rules and expectations, but they're given to us as a rules of expectations because if we align our behavior to that, then we start to understand what's going on. We start to understand life. And that's, again, that practici, physici, theologici. If you get this figured out and under control, and you align your behavior and your actions with the fabric of reality and the love of God, then you start to understand creation. You don't understand creation before that. You understand creation when this is under control. You will not have a good understanding of right relationship to food or the opposite sex or clothing or weapons or cars or anything like that if you are constantly acting in ways that are contrary to that. That's why the church has all these rules. They're good for us because you don't have to understand things before you don't have to figure out what it means to be a good person. It's not on you. You are that impossible task of figuring out what it means to be a good person before you're already living like that. That burden is taken from you. We don't need that. We don't have to do that because we know what it means to live in right relationship. And so we can do that. And that's what produces then that understanding. That's what produces then that greater intimacy and knowledge with the rest of creation. And then that is what produces this greater intimacy and knowledge of God. Because we grow in wisdom. We grow in Sophia. We grow in this ability to come to know God. And we do that by living in right relationship with creatures. This is why John tells us, anyone who says they love God, but they don't love their neighbor, they're liars. They just know you cannot do that. You cannot hijack the system and just immediately love God. You have to work. There are steps. There are things like that. And that's what the church community is for. It's to provide us with that life. It's to provide us with those things so that we learn that, we start living that way. And that's what kind of naturally, in a sense, produces in us this capacity for going deeper. And then ultimately, as we gain mastery of ourselves, as we gain understanding of creation, as we gain love of God and knowledge of God, then we are more ministers in the kingdom. We start doing things that build up the church. We start doing things that allow us to be the image of God to people, so that it's not just us getting saved. We get saved not for ourselves, but for the everything. We get saved, in a sense, so that other people can get saved. Because they see us. Just like Israel. Israel's pulled out, not just to make Israel super good, but to make Israel super good so that the other nations can also become good. And so that's what we do with this information. That's how the fabric of reality is made. And this is what we understand from the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. There is this distinction. There are these steps. You have the separation. You have the reason for that separation in right relationship with everything else. And then the goal is that final covenant, that new Jerusalem, where there is no temple, because God is their temple. And we are also that temple because we're the body of God, who is Christ.